even within our region, where we are pretty much interrelated in many things, not just in transport, but also in logistics, in trade, in finance, and even in tourism and people. So it's very interesting. Now, when I think the situation first started in China, and China being, I would say, many people think of China as the global manufacturing base, many people were caught, actually, I would say, slightly unawares that now things that used to come very easily from China and very quickly produced on order and even just-in-time manufacturing were now not coming. So I would say that even for Singapore, many of our manufacturers and service providers, they were also a little bit caught by surprise, and they suddenly had to start thinking about alternatives. So it was quite interesting for that perspective. But for Singapore, we are a very open economy. We are a global trade and connectivity hub. We have to ensure that we remain open for business, and so you can see that our airport under our Changi Airport Group, our port under PSA is still operating round the clock. There's no issue of us transshipping, or even doing export and re-export importation of all products, especially for the essential items. So I would say that the impact to our supply chain here, at least from the logistics point of view, I think we are still all right. But for our manufacturers, I think they would be having some issues. So just a simple thing, when Malaysia announces the restriction orders, some of our SMEs who had to procure a lot of, let's say, intermediate products like packaging, pallets, boxes from Malaysia, they suddenly were facing an issue. So are these things still able to come out? Because if I can't get access to this packaging material, I'm not able to produce, to supply to my customers. So I think that this COVID-19 situation has actually made us to be very much aware of what are some of the weaknesses or even inadequacies in our supply chain. And I think all companies are looking at how, whether during this period or post-COVID, how they can actually improve and remedy or rectify that kind of weaknesses and inadequacies.
Thank you. And for Brett, I know that Zuelix has some particular issues around the region, perhaps with shutdowns coming on unexpectedly fast in some cases. Can you elaborate more on the impact on your operations?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think you know, we've certainly seen supply chain challenges, and the pharma industry itself has probably been a little bit slower in terms of development by comparison with other industries. But certainly because we're shipping pharma product and medicines and medical products through local distribution networks in country, so we're predominantly dealing with finished product. And so far, the supplies of finished product for pharma have been reasonably resilient. I think one of the concerns is that, or one of the early concerns with China being a predominant source of active ingredients for the manufacturing process, was that with manufacturing shutting down, there would potentially be some product shortages, but we haven't really seen that occur so far, and the factories are coming back online. So from a supply perspective, product coming into our DCs in the various countries has been reasonably stable. And I guess one of the challenging areas is always in situations like this, that we have priority access through customs, and there are a number of stakeholders who are involved in, you know, helping that to happen. We've certainly seen from the manufacturers who are sending their products to us that that they're probably paying more for their air freight shipments than they have in the past, but they're utilising the spot shipments on available flights that they can get. So certainly the reduction in available flights, it's had a minimal impact so far on the volumes that we're moving. I guess on the demand side, it certainly has been a little bit more challenging. We've seen different paces of response around the region from the different countries. In terms of the products that we're managing, many of the governments or the health authorities have identified products which are particularly important for their COVID response. So they're monitoring inventories of those products, although they're not controlling them, but certainly we have to provide updates on where they stand. And then our ability to deliver to the front lines, to the hospitals, to the pharmacies and the drugstores. That's where some of the challenges that we've had to face. But certainly the government hospitals have been particularly busy. We've probably seen demand dampen a bit for private hospitals. Many of the hospitals in the region are dependent on medical tourism or have a high proportion of medical tourism, which has obviously fallen off. So that pushes the volumes down a bit. And I guess as you know, the various lockdowns and circuit breakers, etc., start to restrict movement of people and their ability to actually get out and shop and buy what they want. Probably not so much in the more developed markets, but certainly in the Southeast Asian markets, it becomes a bit of a challenge for people to get to drugstores and pharmacies and buy the products that they want or they need.
And for Ray, you're working in the logistics industry, the sorts of issues or problems you've been finding as a result of lockdowns? Lost Ray. All right, hopefully we can get Ray back in a minute. The joys of webinars. Okay, what's waiting for Ray to reappear back with us? Brett, you were talking just now about some of the challenges you're facing. I heard rumours in some parts of the region that various different government agencies, law enforcement agencies weren't perhaps coordinating properly. So whilst you're carrying or distributing essential products to hospitals and to pharmacies, they weren't always getting through at various different checkpoints because different law enforcement agencies weren't getting the message from the very top. Is that still a problem, or is it one that's been resolving itself?
I think, Chris, it's gradually been resolving itself, but certainly, I mean, again, I make the distinction probably between the North Asian markets, which probably Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea. I think things were fairly smooth in the way that they implemented their COVID response plans and reasonably well organised. I think when we start to move into Southeast Asia, there's been a few more challenges. And certainly the Philippines was probably the first to really start to put in hardline response, implementing its community quarantine and lockdown. And I think in the early stages of that implementation, there probably wasn't the coordination between the members of the interagency task force that they put together. And a little bit of a breakdown between kind of the formulation of the policy, the communication of that policy, and then how that policy was implemented by the various other arms and other stakeholders. And yes, we did have some challenges although there was clear communication of our right to access and to deliver products to the hospitals and to the pharmacies. We did sometimes encounter trouble with roadblocks and security checks and those sorts of things.
Okay, thanks. Ray, welcome back. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Perhaps you could just give us an overview from the experience that DHL has been facing during this difficult period.
So thanks, Ray. Sorry about the IT issues. Yeah, so basically, when the whole issue started, I think the biggest concern that we had was that there was really insufficient information. So if you're looking at global or regional supply chains, the situation was extremely fluid. We were getting mixed messages in different countries, even in provinces of countries, as to what was doable, what was not doable, where was there lockdown, where was there no lockdown, etc., etc. So the initial start of the whole thing, when it started first of all with the lockdown in China, etc., there was a lot of panic. I think there was a lot of miscommunication. There was a lot of confusion. We were getting a lot of escalations from customers, from some of our large customers, and so on. And so that's really more from a regional perspective. And of course, well, as we had more and more, customers shift their sourcing to other countries outside of China, they began to then see other countries and those countries also getting into a lockdown. You have Vietnam, you have India, and so on and so forth. And, then, followed by the West, right, the Europe and then some parts of the Americas region. And that really, I think that really threw a lot of supply chains up the air, because a lot of business continuity plans really relied on the possibility of other regions taking up the slack, right? And you also had situations where I think companies, thought that, that relying on manufacturing in Europe or in India or whatever would have helped. But that's where we started to see a lot of concern and a lot of product shipments that were stuck, basically just unable to be shipped. So that was really more on the global supply chain front. On the DHL front, we are of course seeing a reduction in the volumes that we pick up, and the numbers really range and really depends on the country that we're talking about, whether that feeds itself into an impact on our economic activity. I think that's the jury is still out, because at the moment a lot of that is a function of the different ways in which the countries have been instituting their own lockdowns. A significant challenge that we are facing now is really the lack of air capacity. We have shipments that are literally on the tarmac in some airports, a few hundred tons in some countries, a few thousand tons in other countries that are just waiting to be uplifted. And the challenge we have is that the air cargo pricing has gone up about 400%. So the cost of what previously, for example, was a one-way flight from Singapore to Europe was 250,000 euros. It's gone up to about €1 million for one way, right? And it's because simply of the commercial airlines, passenger airlines being taken off the air, and as a result, there is a significant backlog. Now, whether that backlog is because of, first of all, China opening up, lack of air capacity, etc., etc. I think there's still so many factors that are playing into play now that we don't really know. But whatever it is, we're really stuck with a lot of shipments that really need to be uplifted at the moment.
Okay, so Jim Ming, maybe an unfair question to you, but given what Ray just said, is there not a case for better coordination between governments across the region, particularly in Asia, to help unstick some of these problems? And indeed, for things like air freight capacity, where we've naturally seen airlines cut flights because there are no passengers, because there are travel restrictions, can't governments better coordinate with the airlines to try and get more cargo flights running? You have to unmute yourself, Jimmy.
Yep, I'm sorry about that again. I think for the government-to-government collaboration in ASEAN, I think we have very good collaboration. I think there's a history, very strong history of working together during SARS and also during many episodes. So I would say that from a regional cooperation point of view, all the ASEAN countries have a similar, I would say, collaboration spirit and intent, which is actually to try to facilitate business, get the country up again, keep the people safe, and so on. So, like for example, today there was a ASEAN leaders meeting, a special ASEAN meeting on the COVID-19 actually, which our Prime Minister Lee is also attended, and there was a joint declaration. Actually, if you can Google it, it's actually, I think we all know that governments need to work together, but government also needs time because within ASEAN, 10 different countries, different economic structures, different economic development, different political systems, and so on and so on. So it takes time. But I would say that from government, the collaboration spirit and the intent is definitely there. I think more important is the B2B collaboration. That means businesses should not just leave it to government, but rather not only work closely with government, but work closely among themselves. And I would say that at this front, Singapore has always been a strong proponent of not just G2G, but also B2B linkages. And I think for the logistics front, at least from Enterprise Singapore, something that we have done where we work with the Singapore Logistics Association to launch our Hive platform, which actually stands for Highly Interconnected and Vibrant E-Trade. So it's an industry-led initiative actually driven by the SLA and powered by GATS, Singapore, I would say, E-Trade solutions company, whereby we try to bring supply chain companies, traders, manufacturers together onto a common platform where we can exchange not just information, but eventually see how we can link up in a business way, whether is it transaction or even supply chain visibility, track and trace, messages about cargo movements and so on. So I would say that the B2B part is also very important.
So, Brett and Ray, are you finding you're getting the right levels of collaboration between your companies and governments, and indeed with your customers as well?
I would say from my perspective, I think that the biggest challenge is, just to pick up on Chu Ming's point. Yes, of course, B2B, businesses will always talk to each other and collaborate where they can. But there's a challenge because in some countries, there's a complete lockdown. And so, for example, as you know, in Malaysia, manufacturing has been on lockdown. There's really very unclear rules, and we, as Brett I think alluded to, also we had really a very uncoordinated measures being put in place in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and so yes, of course, whilst I think we've got to look at it from a short-term and medium-term perspective, right? I think in the short term, when governments, rightly so, were worried and instituting measures, whatever business would have done would have been restricted anyway. With very strict fines. I mean, we had to push for and ask for certain types of exemptions in Malaysia, for example, to consider certain parts of the business essential services, right? And so, what would have been nice would have been, somehow a more coordinated response within ASEAN, such that, those running regional supply chains would have got maybe better visibility as to how then they could manage that planning in the short term, right? Because it was really, the bottlenecks are really government enforced measures that basically really put a dampener on the supply chain, or parts of the supply chain, or created bottlenecks, what have you. So, but yes, certainly in the medium term, I think that there is that question, which I think we'll be talking about later, right? Like what would, on hindsight, what would be a post-mortem, what we'll be doing for supply chains going forward. But yeah, I thought that what would have been nice would have been maybe just a little bit more at the upfront, information from the different countries, and maybe a more coordinated approach amongst the ASEAN countries, so that then people were better able to plan their supply chains.
I would just like to add on that between Singapore and Malaysia, actually we have formed a government task force, and I think it is not just to look at other type of policies or so on, but it's also very important to also facilitate businesses from both sides, especially those involved in essential items, to continue and to ensure that the flow remains unimpacted and seamless.
Yeah, but yes, there's a very special relationship, of course, between Singapore and Malaysia in terms of the trading activity and the supply of goods, particularly for food items. But across ASEAN as a whole, with supply chains are so interconnected now across the region, that if we're not getting proper coordination between all 10 member states, or at least between the major economies, you're still running into problems. I don't know, Brett, if at Zwedig, if you faced issues with getting products around the region?
Not so much around the region. I think coming back to your question on the level of support with government, we've seen, I think probably the Philippines was a bit of a nexus for us. We learned a lot from how that kind of rolled out, and we've used that as a template for looking at how we need to behave ourselves, how we need to prepare internally for the engagements with government beyond just the Ministry of Health, which is our traditional kind of partner in the markets, but start to look at where some of the other government stakeholders, Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Transportation, Ministry of Defence, they're all involved in COVID response management at the country level. So the range of stakeholders has increased. I think, fortunately for us at this stage, the Ministry of Health generally has a pretty strong role to play as a part of that task force, and so that has helped to kind of make sure that we're recognised as an essential service, as Raymond touched on earlier, and we are able to continue to move despite the restrictions on movement that are being put in place. And I should emphasise that there's a fairly clear statement from most of the governments around the region that the restrictions they put in place are really around restricting the movement of people and not the restriction of movement of product. And so it has varied market by market and by speed of response across the markets, but fairly consistent in that respect.
Okay, thank you. A reminder actually to all of our attendees on this, if you want to ask questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, or raise your hands and I can try and unmute you and you can ask the question direct. I do have one question already, which is coming from our chairman, Don Canuck, and it's a question really aimed at Ray, but the other gentleman may want to chime in as well. And it's related to the shipping and backlogs and restricted flights that have gone on. And Don says he's also heard of ships being in the wrong place at the wrong time, so backlogs are happening at ports. Is this going to create additional but unavoidable loss of GDP and potential shortages of certain goods, even foods, in the short to medium term? And what can businesses and indeed business groups like the Business Council do to help with coordination and liaison with government on this?
Oh, that's $1 million question, Dawn. Thank you for that. I think at this juncture, right, we're really trying, at least for DHL, we're really trying to keep our heads above water. It's, literally having to ensure that we can uplift as many shipments every night as possible. We're not even trying to, we don't even have the time to think medium term, looking 2 or 3 steps down the road to see what kind of problems this may have, whether this will create food shortages or stocks or shortages of sorts and so on, right? So yeah, we haven't really, to be honest, we haven't really thought so far. But certainly, yes, it is a concern. I mean, what we have seen also in some of the seaports is quite a pile up of containers, and part of that is also the skeletal customs resources that are being put in place. We're not seeing, as in some parts of ASEAN, the Philippines, for example, right? You see the pile up at the Manila port, and understand that that's a function of both skeletal customs resources at the border, brokers, forwarding agents, etc., all staying at home and not actually performing any clearances and any processing of shipments, right? What can we do? I really don't know, because at the moment we're really stuck by the types of ports and the airports we have, and these are all controlled by governments themselves as well, right? Whether we can use secondary ports, secondary airports, again, we're limited by the possibilities of connectivity and air transportation, right? By sea or by air, right? So like, for example, going into Yangon from Bangkok, we literally put shipments onto a passenger flight, strapping them to seats, right? It was that desperate. We just had to get shipments out. In going from Bangkok to Laos, flights have been cancelled. There are actually no flights that go in now, but we've had to ask for dispensation and so on and so forth. So it's literally, we're having to think on our feet day by day just to get the shipments and volumes over.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps we can look a bit further ahead. That's when, hopefully, when we come out of the COVID-19 situation. I think a lot of concern that people had at the very beginning was suddenly supply chains were clearly overly dependent upon China. So when China closed down in January and February, it was really hitting manufacturing of all sorts of goods elsewhere in the world. So perhaps I can ask all three of you your thoughts about how this may alter supply chains in the future, in the medium to long term, and can ASEAN collectively work to improve their own economic integration to try and take advantage of that? That's Chun-Ming, if you want to try and answer that one first.
All right, Chris. I think if you ask me this question, I would tell my SMEs maybe 3 points. I think first of all, they really have to understand their supply chain that they are in. That means they should try to get as much transparency as possible into their supply chain. And this means that you not only look at your level 1 type of suppliers or customers, but maybe you even have to go deeper to beyond level 1 into level 2 and level 3. So that's talking about having more supply chain transparency. I think the second thing I want to tell them to do is actually to look at more digital and automation. I think post-COVID, we are seeing a lot of reliance on manpower. We are seeing a lot of reliance on paper documents. I think Ray also talked about that. And I think today a lot of things are not moving. Could also be due to the reason that the people are not there, and hence there's no people, no manual processes can take place, and there was no digital platforms in place, and hence nothing can be done around that kind of speak. But I would say that for digital and automation, they have to really relook at their SOPs and their processes and really invest for the long term if they want to stay in the game. The last but not least, more importantly, is always have very strong risk management or BCP in place. I would say that many people were caught unawares because of either their BCP were not that solid, or maybe they may not even have a robust BCP at all, and there was no very structured risk management in terms of managing supply chains. So I thought these are the 3 things that I would tell my SMEs that they have to look at. And if I can add on a little bit more, from the digital front, we see a lot of possibilities. I mean, one of those things that we have been trying to get our companies to work together on a B2B level is actually talking about resource sharing. Now, I mean, post-COVID, there are going to be lots of constraints, and we think that a resource sharing type of arrangement or collaboration would be actually quite interesting and maybe meaningful for many people. So we want to look at how we can help them to come together, to use digital technologies, to look at resource sharing, job sharing, and how we can actually optimize our operation through that approach, as well as having more efficient utilization of our assets and resource. Yeah, I think that will be some of the things that I would tell my SMEs.
Thanks. Brett, do you want to answer the question?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think one of the things that we've got to look forward to is just how we strengthen our engagement with the different government stakeholders going forward. And I think linking back to what Chun-Ming was just talking about related to BCPs, that the business contingency plans that are in place, they have to be tested. That there needs to be the dialogue with the different parts of the government that are involved in crisis management, and really strengthen that relationship and start to work on building different scenarios and managing different scenarios. And I think one of the main things from a business perspective is probably establishing a platform for that alignment to take place. And then working with government, I think also to start to align some of the supply chain structures that are required to support response. I think that's where some of the countries continue to be challenged. and I think they can leverage the capabilities of companies like ourselves and DHL and the expertise that we have to start to support their supply chain requirements in times of trouble. And I think probably the final point, again, as Chung Ming just pointed out, I think the drive for digitalisation is going to be a real key move. Certainly we've seen the work from home situation increasing substantially, and the ability to still allow the business to run even when good proportions of the management team or the execution team are not necessarily on site. So our ability to develop remote capabilities is going to be extremely important.
Thanks. If you want to add, Ray?
So I think, yeah, all of what Chung Ming and Brett mentioned, I think one thing for me on the BCPs that is critical and obviously wasn't done by companies is really to test it and trial it. So, you know, even within the DHL, you know, we've had so many different entities, and when this whole issue started, you know, we were asking, you know, all the entities to start updating their BCPs. Yes, they had it all on paper, but actually testing it out was another issue, right? So theory and practice, there was such a vast difference between the two. The other thing for me is, you know, if you're just looking at this whole COVID-19, would a BCP still be able to address the issues, right? Because, you know, and this is what concerns me somewhat, because here you're looking at companies who traditionally were relying on China and of course had secondary and sourcing and manufacturing in other countries, but those countries were also in lockdown. So therein lies the big question, right? What amount of BCP would there be able to address a global pandemic of this scale, right? And so for me, there is a slight concern that I have at the back of my mind that countries will start to question, or companies will start to question their whole regional supply chain setup, their global supply chain setup, whether it be it global manufacturing sites, regional warehousing, and just-in-time manufacturing. Are they going to start breaking up supply chains to look more internal? And therein lies my request to Chung Ming, which I know Singapore government has been a key proponent of, is this whole narrative that needs to continue about, you know, globalization. So, you know, don't make globalization the bad child, right? You know, there are ways to manage risks. How do we enhance this resiliency of the supply chain? So the fear I have is that, you know, if countries start beginning to look inwards rather than outwards, we've already had, you know, so many challenges to global trade with the US-China trade war, you know, increasing nationalism, inequality in countries, etc. Right? And I think this narrative really needs to be, you know, augmented even further with this whole COVID-19 situation, right? You know, we started seeing them with personal protection equipment, you know, respirators, etc. Countries beginning, you know, masks, right? Countries just beginning to restrict the exports of these things for national reasons, security reasons, and so on, right? And so therein lies this whole question for me from a supply chain resiliency perspective. You know, when post 9/11, we had, you know, customs instituted AEOs, right? Supply chain to ensure supply chains continue to be open, right? I think we really need to look at all other types of risks, you know, biosecurity risks, you know, and terrorist risks, you know, and now pandemics, right? To ensure that somehow supply chains will still be resilient enough and continue to be open, right? And how would one do that? I don't know, because I don't think this is purely a customs on the border issue. You know, when we look, for example, at flights now, it's a civil aviation issue. You know, pilots being unable to fly in without being put in quarantine. You know, that this issue is so much more multi-agency and so much more complex. But I think something needs to be done to think through what do we need to do to make sure that, you know, the world continues to operate.
Thanks, Raymond. I would just add that we acknowledge all those points that you mentioned. Thank you for sharing. I think this COVID-19 situation is really unprecedented, at least in our lifetimes. I think many people will agree. So I think we are discovering a lot of new things. But maybe I just share an interesting point, at least from Singapore's perspective. I would say that there certainly has been a strong thinking about relooking at some of these supply chain resilience issues. Whether, for example, do you need RDCs, maybe in different locations instead of centralizing everything into one single location, and whether forward hubbing strategies or methodologies will be helpful if a similar situation occurs. So I thought these are quite interesting things, and I believe Singapore, we are very keen to have all these conversations. We certainly see Singapore playing a role in not just regional but also global supply chain, and we certainly want to work with companies like DHL, like Zurich, and of course with the council to see how we can better facilitate businesses operating in Singapore.
Thanks, Jimmy. We've got a few questions from the audience. I'll try and club some of these together because some of them are very similar. I think one of the key questions is, how do you see supply chains changing in the future? So we've got used to a world of just-in-time supply chains. Things turn up, they're not stored for too long, they're on the lorries and they're sent to destination. Are we going to see a move from that towards more of a supply chain resilience type model, which will mean companies stockpiling a lot more stuff? Or do you think we'll end up seeing a completely different world, perhaps greater movement to things like 3D printing and drone deliveries? Who would like to go first for those ones? Perhaps Brett, as you're in the distribution business.
Thanks, Chris. I think certainly one of the challenges in the pharma industry is in the manufacturing process is such a high degree of qualification and validation of systems and processes that exist as a part of the manufacturing process and a part of the distribution channel as well. So for the pharma industry specifically, I don't see it changing really fast. I think that's one of the reasons it hasn't in the past. I think there will be some emphasis on last mile delivery and how last mile delivery is performed more efficiently than it is today, direct to customer. And there will be some interesting opportunities around that. Certainly, you know, when we look at companies like Amazon and the way they deliver in the retail sector, there are some potential benchmarks for us in the pharma industry as well. And we're likely to see development that area probably quickest. In terms of drone deliveries, I think the various kind of regulatory and security organisations in Asia are probably still a little way away from allowing drone delivery on any kind of commercialised or operationalised scope. But yeah, I think that's probably a little way away.
Okay. And Ray at DHL, of course, you specialise in just-in-time deliveries at the moment as an organisation. Do you think there'll be a shift away from that for you going forward?
And that's the million-dollar question. Certainly at this point, you know, one would be asking those kinds of questions, right? I mean, during the lockdowns, we've had customers literally unable to manufacture because parts and components were stuck in another country, and these are replacement parts, right? So when you're manufacturing JIT, you know, you literally don't hold as many spare parts as you would require. Some of these we had to actually escalate to a number of governments. One was India, for example, where, you know, a lot of parts and components were being held in storage and just unable to be uplifted and even cleared. You know, the Indian government sent the police to close down the entire cargo complex. You know, couldn't even get in, right? So it's questions like this. Yes, you know, world companies be beginning to look at you know, some of their working capital being stored in emergency stocks, for example, right? one thing I would hope for is that perhaps they could relook at how they engineer certain types of products, right? Certain things that can be done locally in the country of distribution, certain things that maybe can't. You start to look at ways in which you maybe think outside the box. But that essentially is a $1 million question. One thing that I wanted to say though, and I think we've seen this with some of our customers, is that some sectors tend to be more vulnerable than others. So I give you an example, right? So you have the automotive sector, where who literally is badly impacted by this whole situation, and their tier one suppliers being semiconductors, with all the self-driving technology, etc., are now being severely impacted. So whilst to these semiconductor and chip companies, the auto sector was the golden child for them in the last few years. One way to start rethinking that whole strategy now. Are they, they're completely reliant on the auto industry to supply, and the auto industry now is really not in good shape, right? So I mean that then means that how do you diversify your customer base, right? How do you look at other sectors and other industries? How do you differentiate your product such that you're able to sell the other sectors? Those are really key to me. Those are key questions now, because you really wouldn't want to put all your eggs in one basket.
Okay, thank you. I've got a series of questions that are really related to modernization of customs procedures to really try and help unstick some bottlenecks. The questions really are around, do you think this current crisis could actually be a driver to help move towards more digital systems for customs, for clearances of customs, to speed things up, so you're less reliant on the manpower restrictions which you may be currently facing at certain borders and bottlenecks? And is there also a move in the EU, for instance, they've done a number of trade facilitation measures at the moment, so moving more to electronic certificates and removing the duties. Is this something perhaps ASEAN collectively could be looking at doing? Perhaps Ray, you want to go first? You're our customs expert.
Certainly, I certainly hope so. So just as a background, right? The WCO is having discussions with what we call the PSCG, the Private Sector Consultative Group. This was a group that was created after 9/11. And that group has continued to exist. So the Cunyo, who is the Secretary General of the WCO, he has been having a lot of consultations with that industry group, and they've put together a number of recommendations. And I think these recommendations apply across the board, not just at the global level. It has to be localized. Some things, short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures, and examples include a deferment of duty payment for SMEs who are cash-strapped, right? A reduction in the physical inspections, but perhaps look more at automated risk assessment. Just looking at documentary type of risk assessment rather than physical inspections, to reduce the face-to-face, the situations of face-to-face interactions between customs and logistics providers or importers, and accelerating any form of simplification, going full paperless, and reduce the amount of manual paperwork and the requirement for manual approvals and so on. So there's been a whole host of suggestions that's been put up. And of course, in the medium to longer terms, customs to move down digitalization, right? I have to say that at this point in time, of course, we are seeing little bits and pieces of facilitation by customs, but I think more can be done post-mortem, but that will be perhaps more medium term.
Thanks. And Brett, any views?
I would say that you'll probably see the more technologically advanced countries are more likely to head in that direction. So probably Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore certainly, but we'll probably see it slower moving in most of the other countries. I would think they need to build that technological capability to be able to leverage the opportunities there.
Thanks. Chun Ming, in a similar vein, what sort of leadership role could Singapore play with the rest of the region in trying to help them to modernize their customs procedures and perhaps advance more on economic integration to take advantage of the economic upturn that will come at some point post COVID-19?
Thanks, Chris. I wouldn't dare say that we are help or so on, but I say we have always been very open in sharing what we have done in Singapore. As all of you know, Singapore was in fact, the first in the world to move towards a pure paperless type of trade declaration system globally. So I would say that we have been seeing a lot of, receiving a lot of foreign delegates coming to study what we are doing here, coming to exchange notes with us. And in fact, many ASEAN countries, if not all, already have some form of electronic trade declaration system. But I would say that the extent of it, and as well as how pervasive it is, would depends on the locality. And like what Brett say, some of the more economically so-called developed countries are already putting in place very sophisticated systems. So I know, for example, China has said openly that they want to look at blockchain and how blockchain can use to facilitate cross-border trade and so on and so on. And similarly, in Singapore, we have our network trade platforms, which is also meant to be used as a platform where we can also interconnect with overseas platform, whether it's the G platforms or whether it's a B platform. So I would say that Singapore remains very open in this. In fact, we are pushing a lot of this, and I think we are active in the various global as well as the regional fora, where we talk a lot about digitalization of trade. And we have recently also talked about trade trust. You can read about what we have collaboration with ICC, that's led by our IMDA. So I think there are many things moving, but of course, like what Brett and Ray said, it will depend on the speed and the pace of each country. But I would say that most, if not all, are for moving towards greater digitalization. I think that's something that I think we all can agree.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of the time. I have a few more questions just to get through. One of them is, what will this COVID-19 and the current situation mean, perhaps for ASEAN for the future and investments into it, particularly perhaps from the EU, given we're an EU organisation? Is there an opportunity here for ASEAN in the future as supply chains get altered? Any takers? Brett, any views?
Yeah, I think there will be opportunities. I mean, I think for many industries, Asia is a growth driver, and ASEAN is one of the key platforms that supports that. I think that will continue. In many respects, they've been first to deal with this issue, and so in many respects they'll be the first to start to build the recovery process, and then into the next way of working, whatever that's going to be. As Raymond said, it's the million-dollar question what it will be, but I think they're certainly going to be very well placed, and they're fairly nimble in their ability to deal with situations anyway. So I think there certainly are opportunities for ASEAN to lead or continue to lead growth and drive that further.
So, Chun Ming, we've already seen that Singapore's got a ministerial group looking at economic resilience and how to take advantage of any economic upturn. I think it's under Desmond Lee. So is using Singapore as a hub for the rest of the region something that you're going to be looking at increasingly?
I think we are always interested to see how Singapore can value add to global supply chain. I would say that we have done that role as a regional supply chain hub, I would say, since the founding of modern Singapore, where we were a trade port between the East and the West and so on. So of course, going forward, definitely we want to see how Singapore can continue to play that kind of high value added role to businesses, not just in Singapore, but also in the region and globally. And I would say that our hub, many people use the word hub, I would say that this hub thing, I would say we will continue to strengthen our core capabilities. We continue to invest in our people. We continue to invest in technologies. And more importantly, we also want to hear from businesses, especially from your council, on how Singapore can do better in order to facilitate more businesses to grow and to expand from Singapore.
Thanks. We'll certainly be in touch with you on that. Okay, a couple of final questions. One relates to supply chain sovereignty, and Ray was talking earlier about increased nationalism, countries not getting things exported outside of the countries. What can businesses do, or indeed governments with a global view like Singapore do, to help ensure that this trend does not continue post-COVID-19? Chun Ming? Sorry to put you on the spot again.
Well, I think every country has its own circumstances and condition that it is facing. So being sovereign, actually, they more or less can do whatever they need to do to protect their country and their people. And we respect that. I think more importantly is from businesses' point of view, how do we look at, I like to go back to BCP again. How do we really ensure that our supply chain are well diversified and resilient? And I think this is not just simply means locating in different countries, but actually it could also mean that you need to establish very strong relationships with many partners, whether it's government or non-government, to ensure that in times of such extreme situation, your work can continue, your manufacturing can continue, and your needs and to meet the needs of your customers is able to be continued. So I think that is very key to us. From Singapore perspective, we have always been a proponent of free trade. And so, as you can see, we have no issue in terms of our borders, especially with respect to goods. Everything is coming in, everything is going out, there's no issue at all. And I would say that this is, of course, this is our policy, and I certainly can't speak for the rest of the countries. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And for Brett and Ray, I think one question you can answer, and I'll ask you to be very, very brief, just 2 or 3 points, but what are the core issues in managing supply chain disruption for your businesses? What are the key factors you need to deal with to prevent disruptions like we've been seeing recently? Brett could go first, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's being prepared. I mean, in this situation, we've also had to deal with, you know, the fact that our people are frontliners, and so we have to make sure that the health and welfare of our people, because they're such a tremendous resource, is important. So it's really preparedness, planning for the scenarios, and you know, really testing the scenarios going forward to be able to deal with the disruptions that are going to occur. I think our view is that this is, you know, one pandemic. When will the next pandemic come along? It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And we'll need to make sure that we have our strategies in place, our communications in place, our training in place, and the management arrangements with the various stakeholders well established.
And Ray, from the DHL perspective?
I think for me, one key area is scenario planning. And it was very clear at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, just talking to some of the entities, DHL entities, you know, their planning, their business contingency planning was based on very cursory assumptions as to what could happen, right? So I give you an example, right? There was one entity who basically said, oh, if things go belly up, we'll just move to another office building. But you know, without realizing that the entire country was going to go into lockdown, right? And so for me, one key area in the whole contingency of business continuity planning is to really look at scenarios and assume the worst. You know, I know sometimes psychologically people don't want to do that because, you know, why would we think the worst? You know, that's very pessimistic. But unfortunately, you know, this is really a bit like Murphy's Law, right? What could go wrong will go wrong, right? So it's literally planning for the worst, hoping for the best, and then just working backwards, right? So, a good thing was when we started challenging a number of entities, when they, and the assumptions that they were making, and basically say, what about this? What happens if, what would you do if this happened or if that happened, right? And I think really not to give necessarily just a rosy scenario, as Brett had mentioned. We've seen the pandemic. It's not a question of when, if, but a question of when. So there are a whole number of other situations that climate change, et cetera, who knows, right? And so for me, it's really doing an honest scenario planning and then working backwards from there, without which I think any BCP would be a waste of time. And the other aspect for me was also working across different functions. I think for us in logistics, and even those in multinational companies who are in the logistics department, right? You got to start working with your sourcing people, your warehousing people, with procurement, et cetera, right? It's just not you managing the logistics on your own, right? I've seen situations where of companies literally putting their own people on flights carrying shipments over, right? Because of just sheer desperation. So really, it's really I think that's when in a crisis situation, your functions literally break down. I mean, your roles and responsibility, right? You would literally work as a team, and whoever can take on the slack, and cover the gaps, right? That's what happens.
Thank you. One final question, if you don't mind. I'll just if you can indulge me for 1 more minute. So crisis times often breed the best in humanity in terms of helping each other out, but they can also breed some of the worst in humanity as well. And I'm wondering if you're seeing increases in things like corruption, or maybe cyber attacks, or other sort of organized crime activities because of the breakdown in supply chains across the region. Ray or Brett, any problems along those lines?
Not from our.
Sorry, go Ray.
Not from our perspective, although we continue to remain vigilant on cyber attacks. We have a massive team based in Singapore, a global team on cybersecurity. But yes, it's something that will, of course, you not let rest on your laurels and let your guard down in situations like that. And so for us, we haven't seen anything of that sort, of that nature.
Okay, thanks. And for Brett?
Yeah, I think we're pretty much the same. We're certainly vigilant to what can potentially happen, because obviously with concentration focused on addressing, the response to this pandemic situation, it would be easy to take your eye off the ball in other key areas. But I think our level of vigilance remains pretty robust, and we haven't seen anything nothing that we can refer to at this stage.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps I can just ask you all to wrap up with 1 or 2 sentences of the key lessons that can be learned from the crisis and supply chains, and also what you think the future may hold coming out of this. Perhaps with Chun-Ming, you could go first, please. Well,
interestingly, we just had a discussion before this webinar. I think we are cautiously positive and optimistic that the transport and logistics sector in Singapore, at least from our perspective, will turn out, hopefully, post-COVID, we will emerge stronger and more well prepared, and more willing to invest in technologies and be more digitally connected. And I think that's something that we want to drive towards, and we hope to have collaboration with everybody in the ecosystem, big and small companies, MNCs and SMEs, and of course working together with our regional counterparts to make sure that our region, at least from Southeast Asia perspective, we emerge stronger, better prepared, and more ready to seize global opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. Brett?
Yeah, I think along similar lines that we will certainly see, I think, probably a larger focus on managing risk and taking risk-based approaches to the assessment of supply chain strategy. I think this This particular situation has driven home to many people who hadn't thought about supply chain before. When you see empty supermarket shelves, empty drugstore shelves, potentially shortages of hospital supplies and necessary equipment, it really puts supply chain as a key focus on how important it is that we establish the capabilities. We've identified some key gaps as a result of this process, and it gives us something to work on for the future to make sure that we have much more resilience as the next event occurs and when it occurs.
Thank you. And final word goes to you, Ray.
Oh, thank you. Save the best for last, I hope. Well, the big thing for me is that, there is a new normal. And just from a mental perspective, right? It's about not expecting things to return to the same as before. One thing that really struck me was how I saw some global multinationals basically changing their types of products. L'Oreal making hand sanitizers, right? You have Razer making face masks, and so on and so forth, right? I think the ability to be nimble, because anything, if you take the assumption that anything could happen will happen, the ability to be nimble and really, really think outside the box and not be stuck in your own little silo or trying to, and the same way of thinking, right? And same approach to how you would, doing things. To me, that's the biggest thing. And the fact that, so many of these ideas and the preconceived notions of the way the world works now is just going to completely change. That puts everyone into, really a blank sheet of paper, and the world's your oyster, basically, right? And it's finding the opportunities, being nimble and flexible enough to change your perspectives of things. I think that for me is the biggest takeaway.
Okay, thank you very much. We've come to the end of the session. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Thank you for all our attendees for listening in and the questions you posed. We'll have another webinar next week where we'll be focusing on the illicit trade impacts that are coming out as a result of COVID-19. That will be moderated by Lena Berstigo, who heads our anti-illicit trade group, and we'll be having participants there from Interpol, the Pharmaceutical Securities Institute, and a couple of our members as well. So please join us for that. Look out for the EDM. Thank you very much again, Brett, Ray, and Chun-Ming. Been nice talking to you. Thank you for the time, and everyone keep safe, keep well, and stay at home. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Raymond.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
guys.
everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.